And we're live for another Austro-Thomism round reading. I almost said round reading. Live reading. We got Belkov, we got Eincast, we got Popular Liberty. Guys, how you doing tonight?
Doing well, Caleb. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
I gotta stop asking everybody at the same time that question. There's always a long pause. And people are like,
There's no
Yeah.
presumed order, unfortunately.
There's no hierarchy. We need a hierarchy.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we do. Oh, going to do a live reading of Jacques Maritain's The Three Reformers, Lusso, Descartes, and Rousseau. I think we're probably going to get through either half, if not most, of the Lusso section tonight. Anybody want to say anything about Jacques Maritain before we get into it?
Sure. Just go ahead.
Okay, just say the basics that I know. So, French Thomist philosopher, 20th century, very much against the tide of French philosophy of the 20th century, famously so. Somewhat critiqued in more conservative circles for being, at least in his youth politically, more liberal in his thought. He seemed to have changed his mind somewhat as he aged, and even his support of democracy was very, let's say, guarded. But the times made him. So he's a product of his culture to that extent. But he also has books on logic, epistemology, metaphysics, theology. He has pretty much on almost everything you can think of, including just the scholastic theory of art, drawing it out to what it could be, since it's very scattered comments. So pretty much an all-rounder Thomist without exactly a focus, just a very broad man in his interests. Let's say, put it like that.
Yeah. I read a story about him today when looking into him that apparently him and his I think it was girlfriend at the time. They were going to college and they remember hearing all of the stories about they were being taught a liberal or the nihilistic philosophy of the French people and all that kind of stuff going on. They both said there's got to be more truth in this. If we don't find it, we're going to kill ourselves. And they disagreed that they didn't discover truth or objective truth or way to discover objective truth. They were just going to commit suicide. So thankfully they found it and they became Catholic. Well,
was his girlfriend at the time his future wife? Just out of curiosity,
yes.
I think he did marry young. I remember that.
If I remember correctly, he died before him, and he died like 2 years later. And he spent his last 2 years living among monks. Instead of having to go back into the rest of the world, he's like, "I'm done. There's no point." And he just lived with the monks. So, great dude. Excuse me, I'm getting a little cold here.
I know I guess what's usually considered for his magnum opus, Degrees of Knowledge, is his big treatise on epistemology. We will probably be doing that for a book club at some point, as soon as we can all sort of get through it.
Yeah, probably multiple episode book club, because
it's a dense read.
How big is it? Just out of curiosity, I haven't looked at it.
It's a little bit bigger than Liberty or Equality by Lenin.
Oh, that looks big.
Yeah, it's a pretty big book. It's very French, I guess I would say. He writes things in a very beautiful kind of way. Where I'm like, that sounds nice. Of course, I knew what he said. It's very like he talked about the beauty of metaphysics through poems, and I'm like, can you just tell me why it's good and not why it's beautiful? I mean, I get it's beautiful because it's good, but like explain it. It doesn't speak to how I write and view the world, so it's very hard for me to get through. So I think how we're going to do this is first section we're going to go through on Lusso. That's 11 pages. Read that and discuss, and then from there we're going to decide where we want to go from there. If we want to continue reading Lusso, if we want to continue reading Descartes. We didn't for the closer, guys. We didn't plan this till yesterday, and some of us didn't know about it till an hour ago. So we're going to
some of us being
wing
me
it and go about this. I wasn't going to say names, but yeah, he's out of the loop.
Yeah, I'm the culpable one here.
He's out of the loop. He's trying to get a degree and study and learn. So we gotta give him a pass. Okay.
I mean, it's not a discussion of the three reformers if we don't at least introduce each of the three reformers in episode 1.
Yeah, I agree. So we're gonna first section on Lusso. I got the link here. Belka, do you have the link already, or do you have a?
I have the PDF open here.
I don't know why I said Belka. I meant Eincast. Eincast, do you have the link?
I'm apparently living in the Stone Age, and I actually checked a copy out of my local library. So I've got a
Your local library had it?
Yeah.
Man, my library has nothing good. I've gone through that entire section of every book they have, and like the best book I could find, they have Catholicism for Dummies. That's like the only philosophy book they have. It's just disappointing. I've complained about it. I'm like, no, fix this.
I have to so perfect too.
I mean, I actually own that book. I mean, I first got into Catholicism, I bought a Catholicism for Dummies book, and I read that one first. So, first Catholic book was a for Dummies book.
Nice.
But let me just say the screen, and we'll get into this.
Well, at least it was written by 2 priests, from what I can tell, so it won't speak any heresy, I think.
Let's hope.
Let's hope indeed.
Yeah, God. Fingers crossed. Okay.
Yeah.
Unless they're Jesuits.
I'll check.
Okay, so this is again the 3 Reformers, Jacques Maritain, 1925, I think, originally published in French. So Luther, or the Advent of the Self. 1. The author's intention. We are bound to the past in the intellectual order, as in every other, and if we were to forget that we are animals which are specifically political, we should be surprised to discover how historically we think, how traditional we are, even when we are claiming to make things new. It is, then, right that we should go some distance into the past in our search for the roots of first germinative principle of the ideas which rule the world today. It is when an idea appears above ground, when it is big with the future, that it is the greatest interest for us, and we can best grasp its real significance. I am not, however, proposing an historical study. I shall ask of history only the manifestation, in certain representative types, of the spiritual principles which it is most necessary for us to distinguish. 2. 3 men, each for very different reasons, dominate the modern world and govern all the problems which torment it. A reformer of religion, a reformer of philosophy, and a reformer of morality. Luther, Descartes, and Rousseau. They are in very truth the begetters of what M. Gabriel Siales called the modern conscience. I do not speak of Kant, who stands at the meeting of the intellectual stream springing from these 3 men and created, so to say, the academic structure of modern thought. I shall consider Luther, not to study him exhaustively and as the founder of Protestantism, but to bring out certain features in the character of that enemy of philosophy which are of consequence to our philosophical battles. After all, it would be astonishing if the extraordinary loss of balance induced in the Christian mind by heresy had not had the most important repercussions in all spheres, particularly in that of the speculative and practical reason. By the very fact that the Lutheran Revolution bore on religion, on that which governs all human activity, it was bound to change most profoundly the attitude of the human soul and of speculative thought confronted with reality. A spiritual drama. 3. Martin Luther, strong summoner of the great undefined powers which lie dormant in the heart of the creature of flesh, was gifted with a nature at once realistic and lyrical, powerful, impulsive, brave and sad, sentimental and morbidly sensitive. Vehement as he was, there yet was in him kindness, generosity, tenderness, and, withal, unbroken pride and peevish vanity. What was lacking in him was force of intellect. If by intelligence we mean capacity to grasp the universal, to discern the essential, to follow with docility and the wanderings and refinements of reality, Luther was not intelligent, but limited, stubborn especially. But he had the understanding of the particular and practical to an amazing degree, and an astute and lively ingenuity, skilled to detect even in others, the art of finding 1,000 ways out of a difficulty and crushing his opponent. In short, all the resources of what philosophers call the cognitive, the particular reason. He entered religion, if we may accept his own story, as a result of a feeling of terror occasioned first by the death of one of his friends, who was killed in a duel, then by a violent storm in which he nearly died. He was not so much drawn as carried away, non-tum tractus quam raptus. He seems to have been exact and perhaps fervent in the early days of his religious life, but he was always anxious and troubled. At a time when the general level of clerical life in Germany had fallen wretchedly low, he had declared from the current of reform, and, as he says, did not let cobwebs grow on his snout when there were abuses to be stormed at. At 25, he was professor at the University of Wittenberg. At 29, doctor of sacred theology. And the duty of teaching, so imprudently given to a man so restless, threw him at once into the acrid atmosphere of human controversy and transferred his zeal into arrogance and presumption. From scholasticism, hastily and imperfectly studied, he had derived nothing but an arsenal of false ideas and vague theological notions and a disconcerting skill in specious argument.
He sounds like Zeddio.
Yep.
Wait, so we're aiming to piss off the Lutherans and the Orthodox in one stream?
There's
Okay.
Austrian and Thomists. I think we pissed off all the denominations but the Catholics and all the economists but the Austrians. So
I mean, like Jay says, Thomas gonna tome.
Well, it's not even all denominations. We're also pissing off the Jesuits at least early on.
We're just taking names right now, guys. Everyone get in line.
If someone is not offended by the end of the stream, we haven't done our jobs right.
Exactly.
If we're not offended, we haven't done our jobs right.
He goes on. What he became later must not prevent our imagining what he may first have been as a Catholic, as a religious, sincerely setting all his natural impetuosity to that pursuit of perfection which he had vowed. On the contrary, nothing is more instructive than to try to picture what that young religious may have been. From his own witness in the studies of De Neifel and Gressar, I note here two things in the inner life of Brother Maritain. First, he seems to have sought in the spiritual life chiefly what authors call sensible consolations, and to have been desperately attached to the experimental savoring of piety, that assurance and feeling which God sends to souls to draw them to himself, but takes from them when he wills, and which are only means. For Luther, on the other hand, the whole point was to feel himself in a state of grace, as if grace in itself were an object of sensation. Did not the theological thesis that grace is infused into the soul at the very moment when sin is effaced drive him almost to despair of God, of all that God is, and all that he possesses? Because he did not experience in himself that perfect pureness of grace? Thus, in a disturbed and carnal soul, a strong mystical homesickness distorted all the teaching of spiritual writers and turned to a brutal craving to enjoy its own sanctity. Luther tasted of the hidden fruits of Christ's grace. He entered the spiritual garden of the church. I'm even inclined to believe that he went a considerable way, but from the very beginning, his inner life was disoriented. The human subject, and that in the highest and most subtle order, became in fact for him of more concern than God. Then, and as a result of the same vicious disposition, he relied on his own strength alone to attain Christian virtue and perfection, trusting to his own efforts, his penances, the works of his will, far more than to grace. Thus he practiced the very Pelagianism with which he was to charge Catholics, from which he himself was never really to be free. In his spiritual life, he was, in practice, a Pharisee, relying on his works, as his scrupulous fidgetiness shows, for he had at that time many of the characteristics of the scrupulous. He blamed himself for all the first involuntary impressions of the senses as if they were sins, and strove to reach a holiness which should not betray the least sign of human frailty. Moreover, he was at the same time tormented by the pride with which the soul in such a state beholds itself. If the sacrament of penance does away his sin, he is at once better than everyone else. I could not understand in my madness how, after I had repented and confessed, it could be right for me to think myself a sinner like others and not to prefer myself above the rest. Then came the night, that night of sense, whose darkness is proportioned to the soul's need to be emptied of self. Martin Luther had lost all sensible consolation. He is plunged into a sea of agonies. He sees with that pitiless clearness which God gives in such cases the vanity and perversity filling his human heart. The whole building of perfection which he has tried to raise with his own hands seems to collapse on him or turn against him in reproach. It might be the night of purification and the time perhaps to choose his eternal destiny. What does he do? Does he forsake himself? Does he cast himself on God? Does he repeat to his troubled heart that great saying of Augustine, vis figurae e Deo fugae im Deum? He gave up praying and threw himself into activity to escape. He tried to drown his anguish in a sea of toil.
Does your translation have the English translation of that the Latin phrase there, or?
Oh, I should be looking at yours. I can read those as well if you like.
Yeah, so
I will hop in with those. Yeah, but mine does not have the Latin translations.
Okay.
But yeah, so it was if you want to flee from God, flee in God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. I need 2 secretaries, he writes in 1516 to Lang, prior of Erfurt. I do practically nothing all day but write long letters. I am preacher of the convent and in the refectory. I am called daily to preach in the parish. I am director of studies and vicar of the district, and thereby 11-fold prior. I'm responsible for the fish ponds at Leitzkau. I'm an agent at Torgau in the suit for Herzberg Parish Church. I give lectures on St. Paul. I'm collecting notes on the Psalter. I rarely have time to recite my office and say Mass. Now he had hardly strength to stand against the malignant fears of nature. I am, he will admit 3 years later, I am but a man prone to let himself be swept off his feet by society, drunkenness, the movements of the flesh. And again, in a sermon on the same period on the state of marriage, what is needed to live in continence is not in me. It is then that at the decisive moment of his crisis, he falls into some great outward failing? Apparently not. But inwardly he fell. He despaired of grace. When a man begins to know the wounds and wretchedness of the sons of Adam, the serpent whispers in his ear, be content to be what you are, spoiled angel, misbegotten creature. Your business is to do ill, since your very being is bad. A spiritual temptation preeminently. Luther makes that act of perverse resignation. He gives up the fight. He declares that the fight is impossible. Submerged by sin on all sides, or what he thinks to be sin, he lets himself go with the tide, and he comes to the practical conclusion: concupiscence cannot be conquered. 4. So far we have only the classical story, if I may dare to call it so, of the fallen monk. Doubtless, but notice, you think he is crushed? He is on the point of breaking free, under full sail for sanctity. It is now that Luther the Reformer appears, that he discovers the gospel, that the gospel frees him, that Christian liberty is revealed to him. What does he see in the gospel in St. Paul? Exactly what we were just taking for a confession of despair. Concupiscence is unconquerable. The resignation of the man, the pessimist, abandonment to animality, a preface to the optimistic surrender of Jean-Jacques and the false sincerity of unmoral asceticism. Concupiscence, Luther identifies with original sin. Original sin is always in us, ineffaceable. It has made us radically bad, corrupt in the very essence of our nature. God commanded the impossible when he gave us his law, but now Christ has paid for us and his justice redeems us. He is just in our stead. Justification is wholly exterior to us, and we are still sin to our very bones. It infuses no new life into us. It simply covers us as with a cloak. There is nothing for us to do to be saved. On the contrary, to want to cooperate with the divine action is a lack of faith, a denial of the blood of Christ, and damnation. From henceforth, heaven opens. Goodbye to torments and remorse. Absolute uselessness of works, salvation by faith alone. That is to say, by a burst of hope. Pica fortiter ed crede firmius.
Sin strongly and believe even more strongly, I believe is what that says, by the way.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that one not translated? Okay.
I don't know.
Sin courageously, believe more firmly than ever,
Yeah,
and
there
you
it
will be
is.
saved. Okay, so he just puts it out.
Yeah, it's just
Gotcha.
not in brackets. Okay.
Now Luther has a doctrine. Now he heads a school, is master and prophet, and he can win over to his theology all the greed, all the impatient sensuality, the putrid fermentation mixed with hopes of reform fed by more humanism and learning than by supernatural faith in the Germany of his day. His doctrine, clearly, is born chiefly of his own inward experience. We must, no doubt, take account of his reading of St. Augustine, ill understood, of the influence of the conflict between conventional and observant Augustinians, which Grisser points out, and especially of the action of the theological stream called Augustinian. But all that is secondary. For that soul, now devastated, it is faith-saving without works, no longer theological faith, but a merely human impulse of trust, aping in its despair the virtue of faith. It is faith trust, which must now ensure the state of spiritual comfort no longer expected of the perceptible tasting of grace, but nonetheless always essentially aimed at. What Luther's doctrine especially expresses is Luther's interior states, spiritual adventures, and individual history. Unable to conquer himself, he transforms his necessities into theological truths, and his own actual case into a universal law. And withal, longing for the moral security and the liberty of the sons of the kingdom, he frees himself, he thinks he frees himself, from all the tortures of the conscience by despairing once for all of all works and casting himself, as he is, on trust in Christ. He is only an inverted Pharisee, a runaway victim of scruples.
Before we continue on that, I want to make a point about how most of his stuff you could say is humanistic. Like everything is very humanistic. There are a lot of Protestants, specifically one named Francis I can't remember his last name, Protestant historian, who argues that the Catholic Church was the creation of humanism, and that Luther was the fight against humanism, and that all of Catholic history is just a story of humanism in practice. And it wasn't for Luther, the entire West would all be humanistic. And so I watched his entire 15-part documentary history series on it. It is the biggest load of shit I've ever heard.
Talk about projection.
Yeah, it was so bad.
The level of cognitive dissonance there, that you can think that what the Catholic Church is all about, like secularism. It's like, no, we kind of like, we start with this idea that man is kind of fucked up and he really needs supernatural grace in order to restore him to what he's meant to be. Whereas like humanism is kind of the opposite, that man has to man has to basically save himself, almost like through Pelagianism, and that ends up being exactly what Luther said, starts preaching through faith alone, that it's this irrational burst of belief that saves you effectively. And it's like you're adding your faith to Christ's cross, which is kind of the irony of it, that they like to accuse us of saying, oh, you're adding works to Christ. You're adding your own works to, Christ on the cross. It's like, you guys are adding your own like irrational belief to Christ on the cross. It's like, hey, pot meet kettle.
Yeah, I think it was Jeremy and Grant from Contra Gentiles who put it this way, for like Catholic salvation, it's not that, you make your own salvation by belief, by faith alone. It's that salvation has occurred. Christ died on the cross. It's whether you choose to participate in it or not, because Catholicism is a participatory religion. We have sacraments, rituals, and all that jazz. It's not up to you. You suck. But we can try to make it better. We can try to make it better. It's not a physician heal thyself stance on things, which a lot of new atheists accuse Christians of. It's very different from that.
Yeah. And I want to take a moment to I don't know, maybe this is a stopping point in Luther. I don't know, but I want to discuss his Augustinian background, because it was that Augustinian theology where he was remember with Augustine, his big thing was love of God, and that was his number one thing. Like, this is like the the element of salvation, almost, not quite, but like, this is how you like almost know that you are saved, is because you were so radically in love with God. But Luther, again, he was hastily, scholasticism, hastily studied, very, very hastily. And he really didn't do enough to understand Augustine, because if he had, all of those problems of scruples would have gone away, because he would have known it's not really faith alone, it's love. Not love alone, but love. Because love has this revelatory, and by that I mean revelation. It has this like revelation aspect to it, where to know God, to love God is to know Him, and this is why it's the first and greatest commandment, because to love another person is to experience God Himself.
It's to participate in being. It's to participate in God's love.
Well, it is the perfect actuation, the perfect act of love is to, because in love there is no sin. And the more you perfect your acts of love, the more perfect your acts of being become. And the more you are actually actuating that potential that you have. And, but because love is to know God, this is like how kind of know that you are saved, because you begin to know God. And this is something that Bernard of Clairvaux really started to talk about. He really dove in deep in De Amor Deo, which is a really, really excellent book, particularly when he starts to get into the 4 levels of love. And the fourth and final love is like heavenly love. And to where it's like the rapturous kind, where you are basically in heaven. And this is
beatific vision, basically.
Effectively, yeah. And so it is this kind of love that because like when you love someone, it's because you know them and you really know them as they know themselves. and is in this that you really learn to love people. And so and to love God is literally to know him, and the more you know him, the more you love him. It's a feedback loop. And so when you so with Luther, because he never quite studied it, he's just like, oh, it must be faith. And it's like, no, you idiot. It's like faith is an element of love, because you have to be faithful basically to the person you love. And and like faithfulness is the kind of truthfulness, and it's a sense of loyalty. It is a it's not simply belief. It's actually belief that's found in truth, because you can't be faithful and lying. You can't be faithful and wrong. You have to be faithful to something that is true. And so it's like that is a element that is involved in love, but it is not the same thing. It's a part, but not the whole. And so, when Luther is, not really studying, and you see that because, it's like he doesn't have time to say the mass. He doesn't have time for really anything. He just like throws himself into works as if he's trying to save himself. Instead, what he really should have been doing was, brushing up on his Thomism a little bit more. And he would have found out that, oh, it's not faith alone. It really is, these actions of love, and it's all connected to that love. And he would have been able to, kind of right himself there, but he never quite did his homework.
And as we'll see later on in the chapter, and might be next time that we get to it, but by the time he sort of gets to the point where he's actually sees enough of the scholastics to sort of know what they're about, he's already far enough gone that he's outright rejecting them. Like he goes, I can't remember the exact language he uses. There's a couple of choice quotes where he just dismisses reason out of hand as a tool, as the whore of the devil, I think, at some point. But also just calls out scholasticism as just the most awful mistake ever made by the church, and a complete rejection of St. Thomas.
So he's basically Jay Dyer. He's basically Jay Dyer.
There's a lot of, the more I read this chapter, I'm like, there's a lot of similarities between Luther and Jay Dyer. Both of them probably being assholes.
Like, I think it's really interesting because this is 1925, and the reason that Maritain is focusing on Luther, Descartes, and Rousseau is he really sees in them the origins of what he saw in 1925. The same kind of things that in the story Caleb told. He was despairing to the point of suicide because they didn't see any truth in the modern world. And those things have only gotten worse since then. Like this is where you see the origins of the reason Jay Dyer can think the things he thinks is because it all goes back to these errors that Luther was able to propagate. It is that same. There's a direct thread from Luther's theology to the modern times.
Yeah, it's that nominalism that leads you to subjectivism, and this is something Jay Dyer's big about, subjectivism. And and he's trying to shoehorn like Kantianism back into orthodoxy where it doesn't quite belong, but he's still going to try it anyway. But when you like go into this, the only things I can know are inside of me is like, this is where Luther's getting that from, because he can't see anything external that shows him that he is saved. And that's what leads him to that despair. And so when he says the only things I can know are inside of myself, this is coming to nominalism and subjectivism, where basically you reversed objective and subjective to where normally you're, as a Thomist, you're supposed to say what's inside of me is subjective, what's outside of me is objective, and I use my senses to communicate the objective to the subjective. When in reality, what he's done is reverse that, to where he says what's inside of me is intrinsically knowable. And, because it's inside of me, I know it. And because, of course, I know myself. Of course, they don't. And what's outside of me, I can't really know that, because that's all of that sensory data just comes straight into my mind, which is, flawed. And it's my senses that are flawed, not my reason that's flawed. My reason's just fine the way it is. And, of course, this is exactly what you see in guys like Luther and Dyer, where they are assuming that because they've logicked it out, therefore it must be true. And it's like, actually, your logic is the sixth and worst of the six senses. It's the most fragile, the one that most needs to be trained. It doesn't work out of the box, the way the other five senses do. The other five senses work perfectly out of the box. And it's your reason that needs to be relentlessly trained as a sense that makes sense of the other five senses. And so it's not
the mediating factor between our senses and reality. We need the reason to be able to mediate to the external world correctly.
And if you aren't, relentlessly training this sixth sense, by, through the church, which is like the objective truth, church is the church itself is the bulwark and foundation of the truth, not the self, not logic and reason, and so this is where the subjectivism, and Kantian epistemology really is in conflict with the, the church's doctrine and scripture that says that the church is the bulwark and the foundation of the truth. Whereas subjectivism will say, well, no, because I have to use my senses to, bring that into the church. And, when you have Luther, who says, I can't know anything outside of myself, really. And of course, he finds the one thing inside of itself that kind of makes sense, is that I have this irrational burst of faith, of belief, that saves me. And because this is the only thing that's knowable inside of me. And he's wrong. And
I actually also thought of Luther as a very sympathetic character, just reading about him. Like, I find myself in situations where, it is despair inducing sometimes, where this state, like, am I saved? Am I good enough? And it really is a surrendering yourself to God and the church, and to God through the church, that I find any relief from that. But it very much is something I actually found him a very sympathetic portrait.
And that's why if he'd only studied his Augustinian theology a little bit better, he would have known that, when you really learn to love God, you kind of stop caring about am I saved or am I not, because the love of God is just so beautiful and overwhelming.
Yeah, because it's not about you, in a sense.
Yeah,
I think it was Spinoza who said it, and he said it from a very different point of view than we would say it. But Goethe singled this out as the only phrase from the Ethics, which was important for everyone, which is we should endeavor to love God even if he does not love us back. Of course, in the Catholic conception, he will love us back, but it's this complete selfless love. But it's this complete selfless love and surrender to God that should be on your mind.
When in doubt, see the first two commandments. That the first commandment is love God basically to the max, and then the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. So when in doubt, whenever you're being plagued by scruples, I say as advice to new Catholics or any Catholics that might be listening that struggle with scruples the way Luther did, like the "Am I saved?" part. When in doubt, go to those first two commandments, because God, that's literally number one and number two most important things for you to be doing as a Christian. And again, doing these acts of love, towards God and towards your neighbor will naturally lead you over time to this, not so much a knowledge of knowing that you're being saved, but that's like, it doesn't matter. The beauty of this is so overwhelming and good that it makes it not matter about me, because it's really not about me. It's about the beloved. And that when you focus on the beloved instead of yourself, this is that sanctifying aspect of salvation. This is what really restores you into what you were meant to be, as this made in the image of God. God is love. The image of God is love. This is what man was made. Love is what we were made to be. And so by making it not about yourself, you stop focusing, and you can kind of cure your scruples by obeying his commandments, like God says, or Christ says, if you love me, obey my commandments. What are the first two commandments? Love.
Yeah, and Christ is perfect man, and perfect, of course, and God, God and man, without commingling, two natures in one. But if he is perfect man and his life was perfect, his life was not about him. That's his example he said for us. There was no part where Christ was partying, to just enjoy himself. If he did it with his friends at like wedding in Cana. Maybe he had fun there. I hope he did. But he did it for his friends, with his friends, and he sacrificed himself for the world. It's not about him. His life wasn't about him. It was always pointed outward. There was no self-contained self there. It was a giving away of self. And that's why he's such a full figure. That's so hard to depict him in any form of media. He is, I think, one of the only figures that's so hard to get right, to paint this portrait of what is a man to be, perfectly ordered. It's so full of himself that he never points to himself. He always points outward. that whenever you see him act, you see either a condemnation of your, not exactly a condemnation, but a recognizing of your failure to miss that mark, or to hit that mark, I should say.
And you even have those two beautiful moments. One in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's praying, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me.
Not me.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
it's not my will, it's thy will.
Yeah, like this is not what I this isn't if it would be your will, let this cup pass from me. And then again on the cross with why be forsaken me? He even despairs of grace in a divine kind of sense. But there's no, it's not this, it's the realization of the significance of the act. It's not that he feels the grace in that moment to do these things, as he empties himself completely in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to jump. Anything more you want to say on Lusso, or do you want to jump to the Descartes section?
Just before that, there was one more paragraph. Is it the unhappy man? Did we read the last paragraph?
Okay, yeah. So I can. Just so we get to
one more paragraph, which I think also speaks to what we've just said, and then we can go to. Is it Descartes next, or do you guys want to continue with Luther?
I would say go to Descartes next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll cover We'll cover the introduction to each one, then we'll do the focus library and each one later.
That works. Okay, so I'll just do my one more paragraph and we can stop. Okay. All right. The unhappy man thinks he no longer trusts in himself, but in God alone. Yet by refusing to admit that man can share really with and within himself in the justice of Jesus Christ and in his grace, which according to him is always external to us and cannot produce in us any vital act, he shuts himself up forever in his self. He withdraws from himself all support but his self. He sets up as a doctrine what had first been nothing but the sin of an individual. He places the center of his religious life not in God, but in man. At the moment when, after the storms let loose by the business of the indulgences, he raises himself in the world against the Pope and the Church. Within him, his interior life is completely overturned.
One thing I don't think we mentioned, but I was reading Kuna Ladine a little more in leftism. He made a really excellent point that last paragraph just reminded me of, that Luther's heresy was not so much a divergence of the intellect as Maritain put it. He didn't really have much of an intellect. What it really was that made it really different from all of the heresies that came before it is all of the heresies that came before it were divergences of the intellect, where like they made a conjunction where a disjunction should be or something like that. And with Luther, it was different because it was a highly irrational one. It was it was a heresy of the will rather than the intellect, and that was what made it so much more powerful. And that it was his will that was errant, not it was non serviam all over again. It was the same thing that causes heresies every time. Eventually, is when they refuse to submit, to the they'll refuse to submit to the teaching. Like, okay, I got it wrong, and but this is whereas other people, the other heretics, like they ended up there, whereas Luther was like he started there. Which was very different.
The intellectual heresy grows out of that in servidum.
Yeah. It was a different starting point, and that was and you combine it with like the times and the humanism that was kind of sweeping through that was going through Europe at that time, and and additionally because you'd had a Manichaeism that had kind of really set the, it's not mentioned a lot, but Manichaeism, or really Albigensianism in the late 13th, 14th centuries-ish, this is why we had the Inquisition. This is what was, it was that dualism there that was laying the foundations of, liberalism with that dualistic instinct of, hey, left and right, this, order, chaos, and all that. This is where all of that comes from, is that Manichaeism. And that, this is why Aquinas was, Thomas Aquinas was so like fixated for a while on how do I disprove this? And what he comes up with is that sin does not have its own existence. It doesn't exist outside of God. It doesn't exist in itself. It is an absence of existence. This is how you disprove Manichaeism. And this is what this is like what was setting up, all the way up to Luther right here, where it's like it's the of the known and the unknown, and eventually this is what sets him. This is what sets him loose.
If I remember correctly, he came to the conclusion about the sin be the absence of something, and the refutation of Manichaeism was doing a dinner with I think it was King Louis at the time, when was the saint, I believe, and he was given a speech at a dinner table, and Aquinas just slammed his fist on the table and went, "I figured it out. I figured out how to rebut Manichaeism." Then he looked and apologized to the king, and the king was like, "Someone go write that down," and just immediately just ignored him, and that's how they became good friends, because he knew Aquinas was smart and knew he had to do something. They were good friends from that situation forward.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, I remember him earlier. The Protestant historian, the contradiction in terms to me, was Francis Schaeffer. He wrote a giant book all about how the Catholic Church and the creation of humanism, pretty much, and it's really bad. We should honestly cover that one day just to refute it, because that'd be a lot of fun. But yeah, y'all ready to cover Descartes now?
So I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up, because I think what might see is a common thread, but the thing about Luther is the sympathetic figure, and Andrew really well covered sort of the historical background. But if Luther doesn't pop up in early 16th century Germany, and if there isn't sort of the political will to hear what he has to say at that point, if there isn't reason for the German polity, for the different princes to say, hey, well, there's something to this, we can use this. No one really listens to him, and I suspect he's able to sort of find his way back. Like, people don't put up with what he has to say. He's condemned, and he sort of has to figure things out for himself. But because there is this political will that is very ready for that aspect of rebellion, he finds an audience and then gets swept away with it. And I think a lot of just what was going on in Germany in that time politically enabled him to a degree that ends up being, it's the reason Protestantism can exist at all.
It's that northeastern Germany place that never quite. Yeah, we always had trouble with it, and they never quite conformed. And it was that Saxony region, which was always troublesome for us. And at this time, that Luther is, really his heresy is starting to spread. The real problem that you get is that the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV is literally at war with the Pope. Like, Pope Julius II literally has an army, and they're literally fighting over territory. He's literally at war with the Pope, fighting the Pope's army in northern Italy and trying to take Italian territory. And so this is why Luther's heresy doesn't really get put down by the state the way it normally would have, like we did with the Albigensians. And so normally the state would put something like this down, but right now the state's kind of ticked at the kind of not happy with the Pope and is kind of looking for a way out. And this is what happens. And you also have France on the other side as well, who's kind of fighting alongside the if I recall correctly, it's the King of the Franks is also fighting alongside Charles IV, or they had some sort of fight between Julius's army and the French. And so basically, wherever you have these reformers, this is also where you have states who are kind of in the mood for a reformation.
What do your take of the so a lot of Protestants, when I bring up the Reformation or bring up Luther, they never really bring up, at least in my experience, it's rare to find one that brings up the theological differences that he argued for, and the five solas, you could say. A lot of it is pointing to all the things the Catholic Church wasn't doing right, like they say indulgences, the prostitution, the priests going to brothels, that kind of stuff, and say this is why he had to leave and couldn't reform the church. They always point to bad acts of the Catholic, and they never really focus or talk about the theological differences. Why do you think that is? And what do you take on that kind of situation?
Based on
it was never rational.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, remember that the origin of Protestantism, it was never really a rational thing to begin with. It was an act of will, and I think it's easier to, if you're just looking for an excuse, it's easy to say, look at that evil over there. It's something that's obviously wrong, but doesn't actually reflect on our theology. Like, obviously, our theology condemns all of that. It condemns the pedophilia today, and our theology teaches, yeah, man's pretty fucked up, and this is exactly why we need sanctifying grace, so we can be less fucked up. And that's something we teach. So whenever we I think Grant made this point in the group chat the other day, that the Catholic answer to pedophilia should be or pedophile priests should be yes and It's like we don't teach that. It's like it's completely against our theology. In fact, it's actually kind of in line with it, saying that hey, man's kind of fucked up, and what did you expect? And we do our best. We condemn this stuff, but it's what it is. Man's really screwed up, and this is exactly why we need the sanctifying grace. And so when you have Protestants who are kind of just irrational and willful and prideful, and historically ignorant, this is it's much easier to point to, hey, they're just bad people, and I'm such a good person because I'm saved. And this is why where that saying kind of comes from, that for Protestants, church is a club for saved people, whereas for Catholics it's like a hospital for like really terminally ill people.
Yeah, for really sick people.
For really sick people who are trying to get better.
I think it was Dr. Peter Kraft who said, you can imagine, the cross sort of looks like a syringe, so you can sort of imagine it as Christ literally injecting his blood into us to give us a blood transfusion to try and save us.
Yeah,
it's a very good imagistic way of putting it. Are we going to Descartes?
I think if you're ready.
Yeah, I think so.
Let me just say the screen again.
Oh yeah, I think I just noticed one thing. Let me see if this pattern repeats in the first Rousseau chapter. So let me just check one thing before we go to Descartes. Yes, it does happen. Okay, so in each of the first chapters, he has a verse from Matthew 4, which is the encounter between the best, which is the most interesting chapter of Matthew, I think, which is Christ's encounter with the devil in the desert. So each of chapters, Luther, Descartes, Rousseau have a little Latin verse from Matthew 4. I think it's Matthew 8. 4:8, 4:9, and 4:3, if I remember correctly. I think that's right.
What does that say? I'm gonna look that up.
That is all this I will give you.
Yeah, I have all this.
All this I will give you. The full verse is haec omnia tibi dabo si cadens adoraberis me. English is, all this I will give you if you kneel down and adore me. When he takes him to the tall mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world. That's what it says in that one. I think Luther's, let me just check really quickly, because this might be interesting, is Si filius Deus mittete deorsum. If you are the son of God, throw yourself down. When he says, the angels will catch you.
Faith. Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Didn't notice that being with. Okay, well. It's up. I'm casting whenever you're ready. Or the popular liberty taking this one.
I can take this one.
Yes, fine. Go for
it. Page 25 on the PDF.
Yep. All right. From the age of Aristotle to the age of Descartes, I see a void of 2,000 years. In that general torpor, a man was needed to set the human species going again, to put new springs in the understanding. A man bold enough to be upset, genius enough to rebuild, a man, etc. Thomas Éluge de Descartes. So, the Cartesian revelation. I or my mind, he said. He produced his effect not like Luther, Arid, or Rousseau, by reproducing in souls the waves of his sensibility, the vast tumult of his heart, but by leading the mind astray, by captivating the reason with signs and clear ideas. It would be little to our purpose to study the career and moral physiognomy of Descartes, the head superbly heavy and vehement, the low forehead, the discreet, stubborn, fanciful eye, the mouth proud and earthly. What?
Are we getting a physiognomy check on Descartes from Maritain? Is that what just happened?
Seems like it.
After explicitly saying it's not, it's like we don't need to do this. But we're going
I don't need to talk about his physiognomy. It's here. I don't need to talk about it. Here's a picture of him, by the way. I don't need to talk about it. It speaks for itself.
I've never seen a picture of him. Caleb, can we get a picture? Well, let me read this again, and I'm going to start this from the beginning while you pull up a picture, and I think this is what's going to make this a lot funnier. I or my mind, he said, has produced his effect He produced his effect, not like Luther Arid Rousseau, by reproducing in souls the waves of his sensibility, the vast tumult of his heart, but by leading the mind astray, by captivating the reason with signs and clear ideas. Let's look at this. Oh, let's pull it. Let's pull it. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ! No wonder he looks like this. Ooh, put this up for the audience there, Caleb. They need to
I put
see
a full. I put
Oof.
I think a full link in chat for a JPEG for a full body JPEG. So you
Yeah,
can,
full body
on
moving
the
of
private chat.
that screen for the full body JPEG here.
let's leave that up and read this description. It's like while we read this. It would be little to our purpose to study the career and moral physiognomy of Descartes. The head, superbly heavy and vehement. The low forehead, the discreet, stubborn, fanciful eye. Oh boy, this guy's like face is asymmetric, is what he's saying. The mouth, proud and earthly. A strange life, secret and cunning. Yet for all that strong and great from a single plan, followed to the very end, and a singularly clear and precocious understanding of the first condition of an intellectual amongst men, which is to flee from them. The moment, short as a wing beat of that obscure dream by the German stove, and of the call to philosophize until death, for the renewal of humanity. What matters is his system. In it, his destiny formed. Yeah,
Okay, now
boy,
we've done the physiognomy check. We can take
that
the
is
image out.
masterful.
It was awesome. I love Maritain. He's just fantastic.
Wow. All right.
Maritain can actually say this because he was a heartthrob when he was young. If you've looked at any pictures of him, he was like,
honestly, all the way to his death, he was one very attractive man.
Yeah, he was like the definition of like a French handsome gentleman, and it was like it's one of his pictures as a young man. He just looks like he literally looks like Henri Luther, who's another famous French painter, also famous for girls fighting for him, but also being chased like Maritain in this case.
I shall not undertake here an analytical examination of that system. I shall try to make its spiritual bearing clear. I address myself to the readers familiar with Descartes in the confidence that they will recognize the points of doctrine to which I refer. Therefore, I leave aside the human element, which in every philosopher, and perhaps especially in this one, confuses the absolute of ideas and diminishes their pure force. And I want to give a bare, unadorned presentation, more direct than the original expression, not so much of the philosophic work as of the spirit of Descartes. Leon Bloy saw every commonplace of common speech as a sphinx crouching over the mystery of creation. It is an admirable way of experiencing ecstasy at every utterance of, say, our hall porter, or member of parliament. There is as much hidden wisdom in the commonplaces of philosophy, even the history of philosophy. What do they tell us about Descartes? As Luther discovered the human person in Jean-Jacques' Nature and Liberty, Descartes discovered thought. He revealed thought to itself, wrote M. Hamelin, 39a. Let us not protest. That proposition is very true in the sense which Hamelin took it. Let us say that Descartes unveiled the face of the monster, which is modern idealism, adores under the name of thought. 2. Angel and reason. 3. Let us try to find the right names for things. The sin of Descartes is the sin of angelism. He turned knowledge and thought into a hopeless perplexity, an abyss of unrest, because he conceived of human thought after the type of angelic thought. To sum it up in 3 words, what he saw in man's thought was independence of things. That is what he meant. That is what he put into it, what he revealed to it about itself. Surely you say the crime is wholly mental. Perpetuated in the 3rd degree of abstraction. Does it concern anyone but lunatics in long pedant's robes, those who have found themselves bound in calf, as Conciliar Joachim Descartes said of his son? It has influenced some centuries of human history and havoc, which is the end not in sight. Before indicating its consequences, let us consider it in itself and try to show its chief characteristics. According to St. Thomas's teaching, the human intellect is the last of the spirits and the most remote from the perfection of the divine intelligence. This is kind of what we were saying earlier, where the reason is the sixth sense that doesn't quite work outside of the box the way the other five do. This is what he's saying right here, that the human intellect is the last of the spirits and the most remote from perfection of the divine intelligence. This one, the intellect the reason needs to be relentlessly trained, or else it's going to go astray. As the zoophyte bridges the gap between two kingdoms, so the rational animal is transitional form between the corporeal world and the spiritual world. Above it, crowded like sea sand, rise in countless multitude the pure spirits in their hierarchies. These are the thinking substances, in the true sense of the word, pure subsistent forms, who certainly receive existence and are not existence as God is, but they do it not inform matter and are free from the vicissitudes of time, movement, generation, and corruption, of all division of space, all the weaknesses of individuation by materia signata, and each concentrates in himself more metaphysical stuff than the whole human race together. Each by itself is a specific type and exhausts the perfection of its essence, and therefore they are born from the moment of their creation to complete fullness of their natural possibilities, incorrupt by definition. They raise above our heads a canopy of immensity and abundance of stability and strength, which, in comparison with us, is infinite. Transparent each to his own glance, each with a full perception of his own substance by that substance at a single leap, naturally knowing God. Also, by analogy, no doubt. But in what a mirror of splendor, their intellect always in act with regard to its intelligible objects, does not derive from its ideas from things, as does ours, but has them direct from God, who infuses them into when he creates it.
Oh, okay. I see where Maritain is going. Okay, continue. Sorry.
Well, that makes one of us. I don't see it yet.
You'll see it. I'll tell you by the end of this paragraph.
And by these innate ideas, which are in it as a derivation from the divine ideas, their intellect knows created things in the created light itself, rule and measure of all that is. Infallible then, and even impeccable in the natural order, considered apart from the supernatural end, autonomous and self-sufficing, so far as the creature can be self-sufficing. The life of angels is an endless outflow of thought, knowledge, and will without weariness or sleep, piercing it in the perfect clearness of their intuitions, not, of course, the secrets of hearts, nor the unfolding of future contingencies, but all essences and all laws, the whole substance of this universe, knowing the power and actions of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, all other bodies, as distinctly as we know the different occupations of our workmen. They are finally without hands or machines as masters and possessors of nature. 39b. And can play upon nature as a guitar by modifying the movement of the atoms at their will. In all of this, we are speaking of the attributes of the angelic nature, considered in itself and apart from its elevation to the supernatural order, as it subsists in fallen and faithful spirits alike. That is the model on which the son of Touraine set out one day to reform the human mind.
Yeah, he set all this up to say, okay, here's how angels work. They are, they can have he used innate ideas, which is something that I think Descartes himself used, a doctrine of innate ideas, where these are angels. They don't have bodies. They're not corporeal. They don't focus on future contingencies. They are wholly different from us. So we can't. So he's essentially saying this contrast, like, why, Maritain, why you're talking about this? This is, this is kind of insane. It's like, well, I'm talking about this because this is how Descartes conceived of philosophy and of the human mind. This is the model on which, as he put it, Descartes set out one day to reform the human mind. It is on the model not of humans, but of angels.
And I was actually having a conversation with someone on Twitter related to this today. I think possibly inspired by Maritain. But this idea that, and I think it's St. Thomas that says the human intellect is barely an intellect, is because we do straddle, but we are sort of this interesting bridge between the physical and the spiritual, because we are embodied, but we have this immaterial soul. That our intellect has to work on the physical. We don't have our ideas innately, as St. Thomas explains, the way angels do. An angel doesn't need to see something and think about it and understand what it is and take it apart. An angel just knows things. As part of its existence, an angel knows by its creation. Whereas we have to know things through the senses. We have to learn things, and then our reason can act on those things. And as we'll see, what Descartes sort of tries to get around is he pretends like we can know that we aren't a blank slate in that fundamental tabula rasa sense, is that we can somehow know without the physical the way an angel can.
I see. Is that a priorism that I can know things without actually having to experience them? That's a big one. I can
spin the whole universe out from sitting in my armchair. Basically,
yeah.
The doctrine of innate ideas. He mentions it here that the angels know everything by themselves. That they are self-sufficient, as self-sufficient as a creature can be. Of course, they still need their act. They still, the unmoved mover argument still applies to them in that sense, but far less than to us. Material and composite creatures that we are.
And all that they receive is directly infused to them by God. As it is not that way with us, where we actually have to learn things through the senses and have to be relentlessly trained to know things, by the church, which is the pillar and foundation of truth.
In a sense, all their knowledge is part of their essence. So I think, I forget who it was who made the argument that every angel sort of has to be its own species, or else you can't distinguish between them because they don't have matter to distinguish between them. But every single species of angels, so all angels, would have to have the knowledge of the entire universe given to them. So it's part of their essence. So to know an angel, all their essence is to know all that he knows, which is to know the universe. And yet, because we are not, and this is partly because they don't have corporeal bodies, they don't have senses. They can't find things out themselves through senses. They can only receive it from God. And this is the innate ideas. The ideas are part of what they are. And this is how, this is one of Descartes' most important doctrines for his entire system, is his doctrine of innate ideas, that these ideas are sort of innate and true, and I can't question them, such as the, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
It's interesting. And it kind of reminds me of what Jung says, that it's not that people have ideas, it's that ideas have people. And this is like the angelic intervention right there is what Jung is talking about, or in a more figurative psychological sense. And because they already know all of these things completely by their nature, and they are in this hierarchy above us, where they give to us these ideas that help us be trained to them. And Descartes here is kind of reversing that to where it's like it's the humans are above the angels in a sense, in the hierarchy, to where the humans can already know everything, kind of by their own existence,
or at least the humans are equal to the angels in the hierarchy of the intellect.
Yeah, that's going to cause problems. I see it. All right, let's continue.
I want to point out, anybody listening, if they wanted to, EWTN, the Catholic News Network, has a great series called Saints versus Scoundrels, where they have actors play different figures in Catholic history opposed to figures from like atheist or secular other sides of history. And one of the best one is they had Aquinas, and they play chess and drink beer together, and it was a absolutely amazing episode they did. And so
from what I hear, from what I understand, Descartes was still a practicing Catholic. So despite all his grave intellectual errors, I do hope he makes it, and that they are drinking, they are having that chess game in paradise.
He wasn't able to read. Let me look it up real quick. Actually, I'm curious about his. I know he was an. I get him and Kant confused with what obviously what religion they were.
No, Descartes was definitely a Catholic. Kant was definitely not. Is what I remember.
Yeah, Kant was pietist. He was basically
Lutheran.
Lutheran.
I'm looking for.
Yeah, basically different Lutheran 2.0.
I started in lay Catholic. Yep, lay Catholic. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting figure. I know a lot of Catholics really, specifically a lot of the Thomists, really dislike Descartes, but it's just. He's fun to read. I enjoy reading.
Yeah, Matt Fred also pointed this out, that he's fun to read, that he's really just going through a lot of sometimes very interesting thought experiments, but that ultimately his system, his very way of going about them is wrong. And the reason why scholastics specifically really dislike Descartes is because modern philosophy starts with Descartes. This isn't even a value judgment. Like if you search up history of modern philosophy, it's 1500s to present. It's pretty much accepted, from what I understand, that modern philosophy begins with Descartes, and it's a pretty radical departure from the things that went previously. Even Roger Scruton has a book on the history of modern philosophy, and it starts with Descartes.
Listen, but everyone in this book of the True Reformers except Rousseau, I enjoy reading. Like I love reading Rousseau. He has a very fiery way of writing. That's very hard to. Like once you get started, you don't want to stop reading them.
Yeah, I'm even reading the extracts here that Maritain has. He's, as I said, he's actually very sympathetic, and and Maritain pointed this out. He had a great practical reason in that sense, not the intellectual sort we would say, but certainly he was a good writer. And and very good at expressing. Like I would love to read like a Lutheran version of the Confessions. I think, in a sense, he was well matched in trying to join the Augustinian order in that sense.
Yeah, it's like he was. It's almost like Luther was like 2 or 3 character flaws away from being like a really from being a saint, pretty much. He's like 3 character flaws away from being like people go, okay, Aquinas, Luther, and that would be like the line of Catholic thinkers.
But what a different world. Saint Martin Luther.
Well, like Andrew pointed out earlier, though, sin has no existence of its own. If Luther and Descartes, if they were just complete scoundrels, if they had nothing redeeming to them, there'd be no reason to talk about them. They wouldn't have succeeded as they did. Descartes wouldn't have reformed philosophy. Protestantism wouldn't have succeeded if Luther wasn't a fiery and intense and great writer. Like there has to be good in them, or they would just be like they would have been completely ignored by history.
Even just setting aside all the missteps in Cartesian philosophy, he did put forth great strides in mathematics that we can't reject. There is a real intellect in Descartes that, at the very least, we can sort of deride Luther's intellectual capacities as a philosopher, but we certainly can't deride Descartes' intellectual capacities in all senses, since he very much was a good mathematician. And for what he did in a very isolated system, if you take his, let's say, first steps as given, then really his system is a brilliant elaboration of it, despite all of its flaws. It's a very philosophical way of thinking. Well, given these things, follow it through to its conclusions, and this is where I arrive.
And you talk about how modern philosophy starts with Descartes. Modern science, modern mathematics, modern physics starts with Descartes in that same sense. And if his ideas could have been properly digested and properly understood using a grounded metaphysics and scholastics, we would be the better for. We would still be using his method. They would just be properly understood. I mean, they're indispensable in how science has been understood for the last 400 years.
I mean, the most used at least in my mind, you can correct me if I'm wrong, definitely the most used mathematical tool ever might be the Cartesian graph. The Cartesian plane. I don't think there is, for systems of coordinates and showing at least the two-dimensional graphs, and at least in one variable, y equals x. And I'm not sure what the 3D would be called, if it's still called a Cartesian.
It's a 3D coordinate plane.
I don't know what it would be called. I do know that the 2D coordinate plane is the Cartesian plane, the Cartesian graph.
It's just called a 3D That's what I was taught. Plane. It's just called a three-dimensional coordinate plane. Okay.
But it's all based on that. So he did do, I think, great strides in that, what we can't deny.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on and on about his contribution to, like I said, I mean, his system is the way that mathematics is done today. It's the way that physics is done today. It's the way that science is done today, because there is a lot of value in it, and it's unfortunate and possibly a little bit inevitable based on who he was in the time that he lived in, that we weren't able to sort of properly digest it. That it wasn't integrated properly into a fully formed Catholic culture. But if it had been, and as I think it can be, the benefits. I mean, the benefits of that system are obviously immense. The technology of the day exists because of it has its origins in Descartes and his understanding of analytic geometry and of algebra.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and continue.
Mm-hmm.
Consider the three great notes of angelic knowledge: intuition as to its mode, innate as to its origin, independent of things as to its nature. You find these three same notes again, transposed certainly, but not less fundamental and not less manifest in human knowledge, according to Descartes. Descartes' first effort, as we know, aims at freeing philosophy from the burden of discursive reasoning, as opposed to the laborious farrago of the school and its swarm of syllogisms raised one on another, a ready, distinct level science, a sheet of clearness. But see where that search for the simple actually leads. When our understanding apprehends, judges and reasons, it is no longer tied down to the three operations, irreducibly distinct in nature. It has but one function, a vision, a fixing of the pure and attentive intelligence on such object of thought, with well-defined lines, with nothing of the implicit or virtual grasped and fully and wholly by absolutely original or primary vision, and with a certitude grounded on itself alone. That is what Descartes calls intuition, intuitas, or intuitus. And it is that henceforth that everything in the cognizant understanding is reduced. For Descartes makes the judgment, the operation of assenting, of interior conviction, no longer belong to the understanding, but to the will, which alone is active. It is a decision of the will which comes to agree to an idea as a faithful representation of what is or may be. And after intuition, he does admit another operation, which is deduction, the operation of reasoning. But that consists of nothing more than constructing new objects of apprehension by combining intuitions, a concession perforce to discursive reasoning, but clumsy and contradictory, which destroys the unity of belonging to reasoning and the continuity of logical movement, and replaces it by discontinuous succession of motionless glances. To reason is no longer to be led by the principle to see the consequence. It is to see the principle and its connection with consequence together. Behind the banal attacks on the syllogism in Regule, we must see tenacious zeal to reject the work of patient production of certitude, which constitutes the life of reason as such, and by which, considering one truth in light of another, a new light is born and rises in us, in which was virtual and hidden in the truth already known shines out clearly. This logical denial is of peculiar importance. To lay hands on the syllogism is to lay hands on human nature. What Descartes really attacks in his impatience of the servitude of discursive work is the potentiality of our intellect. That is to say, its specifically human weakness, what makes it a reason. So by curious chance, the first move of rationalism is to disown reason, to do violence to its nature, to challenge the normal conditions of its activity. Behold it reconstructed after an intuitive type, stiff in the tinsel of pure intelligence and parceling out comprehending immobilities. The secret desire of the intelligence in search of a superhuman condition is to reduce all to a simple perception. But this is a desire which only grace makes truly realizable. In the transluminous light of contemplation, Descartes, for his part, set himself to that form from the first, and in the very work of the reason. He wanted to effect such a concentration of evidence that the whole train of conclusions might be grasped by simple intuition of the principle. That alone is worthy of science. Yeah, and as he could not manage that, he would despair and confess himself beaten by the evil genius. He did not think that in the initial certitudes of the cogito on the ontological proof, that he had found an argument as ready and direct as simple intuitive perception. He would despair, did he not also think that by making the thought of God and the divine and truthfulness coexistent and coextensive with the whole advanced of knowledge, and by setting the principle as the ever-present light in the idea of God, he could remedy the impossibility in which we are, and to which he will never submit, of having at the actual moment when we make the inference, gathered up all in one single indivisible present, in which memory has nothing to do, and the present and compelling evidence of all previously established conclusions by which serve us as premises. What does this mean? But that the sole authentic and legitimate archetype of knowledge for him is angelic knowledge. The angel neither reasons nor proceeds by reasoning. He has but one intellectual act, which is at once perceiving and judging. He sees consequences not successively from the principle, but immediately in the principle. He is not subject to the progressive actualization of knowledge, which he constitutes logical movement, properly so called, if his thoughts travel. It is by intuitive leaps from perfect act to perfect act, from intelligible fullness to intelligible fullness, according to the discontinuity of the whole of holy spiritual time, which is not succession of instants without duration, like time, also discontinuitous, which Descartes attributes to our world, but of the permanence of a stable instant, which lasts motionless so long as it does not give place to another motionless instant of contemplation. That is the ideal limit, the pure type of reason conceived in the manner of Descartes.
Is that a good place for us to stop for a little bit?
Yeah, I was also going to suggest that.
So I'm reminded. So a couple of us have been going over Edward Feser's 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, and in each of the proofs, at some point he'll go through and sort of give a nice summary of the proof, and it will start with something observed in the world, the existence of change or whatever it is, and then painstakingly goes through like 40 or 50 steps. And concludes with, okay, therefore we know that God must exist, and that's this, and it's we've sort of bemoaned how arduous it can be to get through those things, but like I was saying earlier, the human intellect is barely an intellect. Like we have to sort of trudge through these things because we don't have any other way to go about it. we don't really think about it, especially because of sort of the Cartesian influence on our world. But the process of understanding anything for a man is so exhausting in terms of what you have to go through, because you start with such bare bones things that you start with hot, cold, red, blue, bright, dark, and from that we have to reason. Every idea that we have in our head has to come from those very basic things. And Descartes just cannot tolerate this. He wants to be able to say cogito ergo sum, and where can I go from there? He wants to jump immediately from there to therefore God exists. Like he wants to sort of cut out those middle 50 steps because he wants to be an angel. He wants human intellect to be an angelic intellect, and our experience of the world just does not and cannot work that way. We have to start with those things that he wants to deny. He wants to deny the primacy of the senses and wants to start in his own head. Like Andrew was mentioning earlier, it's this pure subjectivism. And whereas Luther was trying to sort of abandon reason and say, okay, I'm just going to have my faith, Descartes wants to try and recreate reason. He wants to try and reason through the entire world from a subjective. He wants to start with a subjective worldview and then try and understand anything.
So basically, he's presupposing orthodoxy, basically.
Yeah. But if I could put it in a metaphor, the way discursive reasoning works, as exemplified by something that we've done, Phaser's 5 Proofs of God, with 50 steps. It's not that Descartes denies deduction. He does deduce from his principles, but Phaser is like, okay, we have this truth and then this truth, and also these two truths make a third truth, and then there's this fourth truth combined with this third truth, there's a fifth truth, and so on successively. And a lot of his truth is got from senses, such as change, and I have to also acknowledge my senses. And okay, if change has to be this, it can't be that, because change has to occur, because if change doesn't occur, you have this consequence, and if all is change, then this versus this consequence, and this is not true from what my senses tell me, from what my intellect tells me. And okay, we have this whole series of truths on which we can then get God exists. What Descartes is trying to, and that's a stitching together of you're knitting something. Imagine you're knitting something. You're getting several threads and you're knitting this beautiful tapestry. What Descartes wants is that he wants to have the beautiful tapestry and trace it line by line already, or you'd rather have it all like, let's say, rolled up, and he wants to unfurl it by deduction, but you get it already in the first principle of cogito ergo sum, for example. You get it from the first innate idea, the absolutely true idea, and then all else is contained within it, is a pure implication of that innate truth.
Essentially, this is the danger of a priori reasoning, where you're trying to you're trying to separate the empirical, you're trying to separate senses from logic. And if you're not checking your logic and your conclusions against reality, you're going to get wrong answers. And this is where I think the Austrian School of Economics makes some, mistakes, where they say that no, the intellect cannot be checked against reality. I'm like, well, that's kind of how science works. You can't just say it's logically true, therefore it is true. No, actually, not at all. This is not how human reason works. It is necessary. It is necessary that we actually have to check these things against reality. That does this actually stand up to reason? Does this actually stand up to what our senses perceive? And sometimes no. Sometimes it's like, okay, they should, this is how many times have you heard the Austrians predict that, oh, we're about to have the bust, and the bust is here, and, buy gold now, buy, and, it doesn't happen. It's like that. And because, a priori, logically, it might be logically, make sense, but that doesn't mean it's empirically true, because empirically, the nature is usually a little bit more complex than that. There's usually quite a number of principles at work, not all of which are, taken into account. So if you're only using one single principle, you're going to make mistakes because the world is not one single principle. There's quite a number of them that God has created into nature. He is the first principle. I mean, if you're starting with your first principle of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all came into being through him.
but that's not the ordering of our understanding. Is we don't, the first principle that we know is not is not the existence of God. I mean, that is the first principle, but it's not the first principle of our knowledge.
That had to be revealed to us.
Yes, it's because of our physical nature that the principles are discrete and numerous. Is that we have to reason from the lots of different things that we see directly.
And it's only when you understand that all of these other principles that that we have to use to reason, all of them must be in accordance with this one particular principle. Hey, in the beginning was the Word. It's like if that must be the first, that all of the other principles must be in accordance with that one. So if you're not having that one, as presupposed in all of the others, there's going to be problems. You're going to get wrong answers. And so so in some sense, he has a decent idea, but he didn't start there, which is why he got problems pretty much immediately.
This is why I've been sort of shouting at a mutual acquaintance of ours repeatedly when he tries to claim that empirical observation can't give you anything about truth. Because if observing the world can't tell you truth, we don't have another way to get at truth. We have to start from the principles that we can observe in the real world, and the only way we have to access those is we have to realize those principles by like Andrew saying, we have to see that they exist. We can't even cogito ergo sum. That's not our first principle. You have to realize that by thinking about things that you sense in the real world.
I will be right back. Give me 2 minutes. You guys can go ahead and read that. Sure.
We jump into I think that covers a good introduction for the call. I'll read the Rousseau part if y'all don't mind. I haven't said enough this entire podcast, so I gotta get my voice out there a little bit.
All right.
This is I absolutely love. I'm probably going to say I absolutely love this book. I love Maritain, but this is one of those topics to kind of cover where it's like this is a lot of new information for me. So I'm trying just to don't want to speak and say something stupid. So I should be used to that by now, but.
and there's just like I'm repeating myself, but there is so much in the people that he's covering that is so essential for understanding the world we live in now.
Yeah,
as the ways that we can see the like Andrew mentioned, the a priorism. Like, I mean, this also Descartes is the reason that people can try and presuppose the world when they try and invent their theology or their metaphysics. I mean,
so much of you could look at everything. Pretty much, I can't stand about modern society in the left, and you can trace it back to he's one of these three figures. It's pretty. I like the fact that he names the people, and I can now know what to read more about. I like how he spells it out. It's again a great book. Like people ask me, what are the 5 authors they should read? I list Eric von Knut-Leden, James Burnham, Thomas Carlyle, James Burnham, Carlyle, Leden, Hopper. Yarvin? No, I'm losing. I always include this book. Like I include Maritain, True Reformers. They'll give you a philosophical, theological side and the generation of the rest, you could say. And so I think it's absolutely crucial for people to read. Let's continue. Rousseau, or Nature's Saint. If someone wants to read the Latin phrase here, that'd be.
Let's see. Dic ut lapidus isti panes fiant, Matthew 4:3. Let's check that really quick.
Was it command the stones to become bread?
Dic ut lapidus is, yes, it is indeed. Command the stones become bread. I haven't even checked it. Let me actually see if we're correct or just. But panes, lapidus is stone, panes is bread. It has to be, right? Let me just check. Matthew 4:3. You are the Son of God, commanded these stones become bread. Indeed it is. You were correct.
If my husband is not a saint, who is? Therese?
I don't know which Dehes that's referring to. Maybe Dehes de Lisieux, in which husband would be Christ, so I don't think that is. Maybe? Wait, who was Rousseau's wife? Give me a moment. Rousseau wife.
I think he actually abandoned them. I know he abandoned his kids and said that they'd be better off being raised by the state.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so his wife was called Thérèse Levasseur. Indeed, that's probably from Thérèse Levasseur, the wife of Rousseau, and that's either very early on in the marriage or a highly ironic comment or Stockholm syndrome. It's one or the other.
So they were at least married until his death. I'm not sure the details around that, but they were
I'm
married
almost certain that either he fled with a lover or he did flee with her and she was madly in love with him. But they did abandon their children. I just remember I read a book on the friendship of Adam Smith and David Hume. Very interesting. I forgot the name now, but there's one part which was David Hume's involvement with Rousseau, because Rousseau was a paranoid schizophrenic. Apparently, he always thought he was being chased by everyone. And he basically and David Hume was like, "Oh, you're being chased? Okay, I believe you. I'll literally shelter you in England. I'll pay for everything. I'll help you in any way I can." Because David Hume, despite his very bad philosophy, I would say, he was apparently a good man from every indication I can find. So he just tried to help him, and he just abused him for years. Just swindled him. For years and years, while Hume's friends were like, "This guy's obviously a scumbag. Please stop doing this." And he's like, "No, I have to help him." For years and years and years. And it's the most absurd chapter because I knew nothing of Rousseau's life before this. And, I was just shocked reading all of it. It's I think the longest chapter in the book. And it's just page after page of like horrible things Rousseau did to Hume, and it's
Rousseau, he's like a real piece of work. Like this dude, like he was abandoned by his parents as a kid, and this is where he gets his antisocial behaviors and tendencies from. This dude's like an orphan, and not like the worst, not like the worst kind of, and he's like the worst kind of orphan. It's not like Batman where his parents died and it wasn't like anybody's fault. It's like his his authority figures abandoned him, and like no one loved him, and he ends up being just a nutcase, because of this, and just abusive, it's like psychotic, antisocial, and it's like every worst kind of. He's a ball of mental illnesses all rolled into one. And this is the
typical leftist.
Exactly. This is where that comes from.
Leftist, right? Like he is left.
There's a great book, Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's basically a history of different popular leftist intellectuals and their personal lives and how shitty they were. Most of them were the kids, or basically it's just a history of like, hey, all these people you heard as intellectuals were kind of shit people. And it's a pretty good book.
And so why that family is so critically important as the fundamental building block of society. The individual is a nutcase by himself. The individual cannot subsist by himself because he turns out like Rousseau, and the individual is completely insufficient for himself almost by definition. Again, man is created in the image of God, to have that interpersonal love. And so if he doesn't have that, if he's just one person all by himself, if he's an individual, he is like he is like a fraction of himself. You are far more yourself when you're married and you have a kid and you love people and you're stable like this. If you don't have that, you're not a stable person. You're not a stable person. You're not in the image of God. The image of God is not merely to have reason and have these other gifts that he's given us. It is to be using them, towards other humans, for their benefit, to be willing their good and their truth. Yeah. And so if you aren't doing that, with children particularly, they're going to grow up to be leftists, basically, because that's kind of what happens. It's a real causal reality. So of course, if you are, if like you're like Rousseau's parents and you abandon your kid, I'm pretty okay with you being sold into slavery and your kid being, raised by the church and you being sold into slavery to pay for it. Like, I don't think you have rights. If you abandon your child, your rights are basically null and void. That's like, you can just be sold into slavery. If you're if you're a bad parent, there needs to be some sort of bar there. And I'm okay with raising those laws, to be pretty stiff.
Yeah, Maritain has a great paragraph and later in the chapter on Rousseau about the individual and the insanity of the individual, and it's So I cannot wait for us to get to that specifically that paragraph next time we do a live reading, because it's really good. But let's continue with the Rousseau chapter. I can't believe we had that much to say after this one quote. This is gonna be great. So we've already gone for an hour and a half. We're gonna be here for a while.
I almost think this is almost a stopping point. I know we said we would introduce all three of them, but Rousseau really is his own little nutcase. He kind of deserves almost the whole time to himself to unpack. He's that nuts. It's I
kind of agree.
Mm-hmm.
I almost think this is a stopping point, and we should leave Rousseau for next week.
Yeah, do a whole maybe cover a majority of that chapter before you go back and try to do Rousseau.
Pretty much, I think he really deserves his own thing. This guy is such insane. A basket case.
Yeah, it's. So I will say I love his name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's fun to say. That's the only thing I like about him.
And whereas Luther and Descartes are both a little bit more in history, Luther in the early 16th century, Descartes in the early 17th, Rousseau coming into the 18th and almost 19th century. I think he died in 1780 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
We modern society has really sort of integrated Luther and Descartes, not for the worse, I would say, but they're very much a part of just everyone. They're really sort of in the groundwater, as it were. Whereas Rousseau very much is still just
he's not integratable.
He's very clearly identified with the left. There is the reaction to Rousseau is much more palatable, whereas so much of Luther and Descartes, everyone sort of suffers from presuppositionalism. Everyone sort of has a lot of Luther's neuroses in the culture. Rousseau, it's so much more in your face just how screwed up he is when you look at his life.
Yeah, it's Descartes and Luther. These are much more sympathetic characters. The moment you really start to learn about Rousseau, you're just what a basket case this guy is. What a just an awful human being. I mean, and it's easy to see that how his ideas were so apparent and so permeating the French Revolution, which was just a terror on the people. I mean, it's these people were worse than the Nazis. Literally were. If they had the technology of the Nazis, they would have been so much worse. And it was literally only that, it happened 40 or 50 years before the Nazis that they weren't worse. They had 50 years earlier technology. And this is the only reason that they weren't, so much worse. And it's all due to Rousseau. And, tune in next time.
If anyone hasn't heard we did a live reading of Eric Ledin's Monarchy and War. He goes into some of the details of the horrors of the French Revolution. So I'd rather not repeat them here, but that's a good place to get us started looking at just how awful awful that was.
Kunal Ledin really unpacks it even more in his book Leftism, which I've been reading. I mean, it's just eye-popping how bad these people were. I mean, they really were worse than the Nazis in terms of their sheer creativity. And they didn't quite have the technology that the Nazis had, but they had their brutality, and they used as much of their creativity as they could in order to compensate for their lack of technology in terms of their unhinged cruelty. And they would when soldiers were, enemy soldiers were lying in the hospital, they would come into the hospitals, shoot them. And then if their wives were there, kind of comforting them, they would rape the wives and then, in the throat and then cut their throats and then rape the dead bodies, with necrophilia orgies, out in public. Insane. I mean, it's these were nuts people, and they're all due to Rousseau. Yeah, and Rousseau is just not a sympathetic character at all.
No. Ledin has this great quote on the French Revolution. It says, "For the average person, all problems date to World War II. For the more informed, to World War I. For the genuine historian, to the French Revolution."
Yeah,
it's really something that's talked about a lot. It's never really delved into. which is I don't blame people for not delving into it, but you hear about the French Revolution, I feel like quite a bit, specifically juxtaposed to the American Revolution, and it's never really delved into how batshit insane the French Revolution was.
The myth of the modern world is that all of the madness was due to like the Nazis and Hitler. It's like we really shouldn't be saying he's this person that Donald Trump is like literally Hitler. We should be saying he's literally Rousseau. That's the guy. He's literally the Frenchies, or who was the not Rousseau, the revolutionary head revolutionary. I'm blanking. Robespierre. There you go. He's literally Robespierre. That's who we should be saying. I mean, that should be a meme. The Austro-Thomism meme that Biden is literally Robespierre.
We see. I'll get started on that one. Is there a specific chapter in leftism when he delves into the French Revolution, or is it kind of overall?
I'm in part 2 on skeptical ways, and I'm about an hour in, and I'm just like jaw dropping how utterly cruel these people were.
We should find that specific chapter or something that focuses on it, to live reading that one little bit, because I think leftism is a great book, and I want to eventually cover that. But like a lot of other books, like it's too big for one book club. So either live readings or multiple parts, but it's a good one. Maritain, two great Catholics people don't know enough about. We need to fix that.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyone have any final plugs or final thing they want to say before I wrap this up?
Well, I don't know. I think Maritain speaks very well for himself, but it's certainly very interesting, his comparison with the how I'd never thought about how Descartes. I know he got the nature of human reason wrong, but I never thought of he actually got another nature right. He got the angelic nature right. He just applied it to the wrong creatures. That's a very interesting thought. I don't know if maybe as being a lay Catholic himself, if Descartes had any inspiration from sermons growing up or something like that on angels, but that's a very interesting thought. And then Luther, just a very sympathetic portrait in general, despite the occasional insults, such as being lacking in intellect, but a very sympathetic portrait, and I can certainly see how that would lead him where it did. Those are my thoughts on it so far. But in terms of plugs, I've removed my ads so that internet Lutherans cannot scream at me.
Ankath, any final thoughts or plugs?
Nothing to plug in particular. I will sort of echo Bulgakov's statement, and also sort of something we touched on, that Maritain speaks well for himself, but he's really identified in 3 individuals a lot of the source of the modern world. You'll hear a saying occasionally when people are talking about sort of neo-Marxist, we live in whoever's world, we live in Herbert Marcuse's world, we live in whatever else. Really, we live in Luther, Descartes, and Rousseau's world in various ways. Is the errors of their philosophy, of their theology, of their morality is very much a part of the world we live in today, and understanding the origins of that is so key to understanding where did things go wrong, and how can we Maritain had the little section at the beginning about how important history is to a social people or to a social animal, and really understanding that this is where these things start is very critical, because I think a lot of people just sort of say, okay, if either they just implicitly accept these very strange ideas, or they realize that they're wrong, but they don't really know how they come about. And this really delves into where they come from. Andrew
had the dip. I'll give his plugs for him. He's at I think he's actually at Political Catholic on Twitter now. Let me make sure of that one. His plugs are in the description, but let me just plug him correctly. At Popular Liberty on Twitter, at _. He's also on Subscribestar, and he has the GOP Mises Caucus for the anti-tax program. I got nothing to really plug. Nothing major coming up besides more live readings. Website is still down. I finally figured out the error, I think, and I am in the process of updating it. What it was, they had update the ways you design the website, and so I have to now work out how to work the new insight building system, which is very difficult. But I'm hoping to get it up by the end of the month. Not this month, end of July. My computer is really slow and it gets stuck, and so it's like we start and I can't always save. Like we do the same page a couple of times, and it's just a major hassle. But I'm gonna get it back up soon.
And maybe possibly something to plug. I think, Caleb, we might be talking about related to Descartes. We were probably having a talk sometime in the next week or so. That should tie in directly to Maritain's discussion of Descartes. So hopefully, it'll be a nice interlude and relevant to that.
I hope so. Make sure you guys like, comment, share, subscribe, boost the algorithm, all that good stuff. Follow us on Twitter at Austro-Thomism. I'm going to self-plug my own Patreon. It is it is Face Liberty as FL and not the symbol, actually word and P .com on Patreon. Support my Patreon. It's super cheap. It's like $5 a month. You don't really get anything special out of it because I haven't figured out how to upload special content yet, but please support the show because I spend too much money buying books not to make money off of this. Anyway, I think that's about it. Super excited to continue reading this. Love Maritain. He is just incredible. And he's like, you look at Maritain on YouTube, you get like 5 videos maybe, and the highest only has like 7,000 views. Like, he is not really talked about, and it is a real shame because he is just incredible. But besides that, everyone have a good night.